Welcome back to the Prairie and Savannah 101 session. Before I introduce the second speaker in this session, I'd like to remind participants that they submit questions for speaker during and after the talk by using the Q&A section. Attendees will not have the option to speak unless the host asks the individual to unmute. Our second speaker for this session is Dr. Dan Carter. Dan is TPA's Landowner Services Coordinator under funding from the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation. Dan is a plant ecologist that has been involved in prairie restoration, reconstruction, management, and protection as an educator, researcher, planner, and volunteer. He has extensive experience in natural area assessment and field botany. Dan uses this expertise to assist private landowners assess the potential to restore, reconstruct, or improve prairie and associated ecosystems on their properties. His presentation is titled Prairie Management 101.
Hi, I'm Dan Carter. Thanks for the opportunity to speak. When I was asked to give a talk on the topic Prairie Management 101, I had really no idea at first what I would be talking about because it's such a broad topic. So what I arrived at really was a talk that's more generalized and overarching, and it's really focused on two different parts. Generally, considerations to make in advance of implementing any sort of project, and then some approaches for actually implementing stewardship within projects. And I'll take a more specific tack there, more details to come. But the idea here is that this is just to give people an idea of the sorts of things that they need to think about. So the first thing, and this seems really common sense and perhaps intuitive, and why would I even need to say this, but learn what you have. It's especially important because I'm not coming at this from a historical perspective and saying you need to know exactly what species you had, and we're going to be moving towards having the exact same species composition that was there before Europeans walked onto the scene. But it's important to know what you have and what constrains potential restoration projects, because the natural communities that developed over time prior to their degradation, prior to overgrazing or cultivation or draining, the things that necessitate restoration, those constrain what can be done. So, kind of a little bit of simplistic plant community theory, but there are constraints or drivers of plant community development that have to do with that drive things to hold characteristics in common. There are deterministic factors, so soil, parent material, hydrology, things like that lead to plant communities that develop similar species compositions and characteristics, and those things are often still present and will constrain what can happen. And then there are other factors that are more random that drive community development and composition. Those are things that, from a restoration standpoint, you actually have some control over. We're trying to implement restoration projects on the landscape to fix natural communities or to build them again from scratch. And we're trying to do this all very quickly on human time scales. These are communities that initially developed over thousands of years, with species arriving at their own pace and sometimes going away and coming back. So it's important to appreciate that, just so you know sort of what the guideposts are for your restoration project. Part of that is recognizing the communities, but another part of that is just recognizing the species that depend on those communities. So, for example, these are calcareous fen species, blue-leaved willow and sterile sedge. And if you have species like that already present on your property that are associated with community types that have become rare on the landscape, they may not be threatened or endangered or special concern. They may not be on any lists, but these are species that have undergone dramatic declines on the landscape because of different dimensions of human land use and land cover change. So they're very ecologically valuable and genetically valuable. They're species that should be considered with for management practice purposes. They're potentially critically important for other restoration projects that might happen nearby your restoration location. So that they're the raw material for the work that you're going to do and for what other people may be doing. But you might also have listed species. And if you have listed species, if you have vulnerable, critically imperiled species, or natural community types, you have an outsized responsibility to their conservation. Other people don't have those opportunities in many cases. So, for example, this is kittintails, Midwestern endemic that's state threatened, that happens to have quite a few occurrences in parts of Wisconsin. So landowners that have it should be thinking about it as they implement their projects and potential impacts they could have on its populations. Invasive species are a big deal. Almost everybody is dealing with different invasive species or weedy native species, woody species in particular when it comes to savannas and woodlands. And they require different management. So, for example, Asian bittersweet will resprout from its entire root system if you forestry mow or if you burn. Buckthorn or honeysuckle will resprout from their crowns. So it's easier to follow up with foliar treatment if that's what you're doing, even if that's not really what I would recommend you do. So there are vastly different consequences for managing different invasive species, different weedy native species, different ways. So it's important to understand what those are before you get started. There are a lot of wonderful resources for doing a historical review of land use on your property, on the property you're managing. So in the state of Wisconsin, and I'll have these resources on a slide at the end. In the state of Wisconsin, there's an interface where you can find generally 1930s aerial photography, in some cases early 1940s aerial photography. And what that can do is help you build a sequence of land cover on your property from present going back in time. And when you see something like this, savanna pasture with individual discernible oak trees, it actually carries you farther back in time because those oak trees are mature. So you know something about the land cover there going back, to the time that those oak trees started growing. They started growing in an open, probably savanna environment. There's other cool stuff that you can pick out of these. So the area just to the left of the savanna pasture in this air photo is a sedge meadow fen complex. And immediately to the west of that, it looks like there's agricultural land use. But if you look closely, you can see the evidence of windrows and that's been hayed. So that's likely marsh hay or sedge meadow hay. And it just appears different right now because biomass has been harvested, it's been collected. And so depending on what happens subsequent to this, there may still be remnant sedge meadow or low prairie where past land use was hay like that. The original land survey notes are also digitized and available, at least in Wisconsin, and I believe they are in Minnesota and possibly Illinois as well. And those can be really special. A lot of landowners have a land survey transect along the property line. If they have a property line that coincides with a land survey section boundary. In some cases, landowners have a transect going right through their property. And even if not, oftentimes you can find a transect that's nearby that passes over similar geographical or geological features that likely had characteristics that were similar to those on your property. And this is one of my favorites among those that I've come across. This is along the Root River corridor on the Milwaukee-Racine County line. And this is one of the places where there's a really sharp and distinct boundary between the eastern hardwood forests and the prairie. There was a large open prairie that extended from here southward into Racine County. And here you see, notes along the land survey transect, and the surveyor says, enter prairie shortly after crossing the Root River. And that is literally the land surveyor leaving the eastern deciduous
hardwood forest and entering the big open prairie. And some of these surveyors took other sorts of notes that are valuable. So in southeastern Wisconsin, and also I've seen this in parts of western Wisconsin, surveyors took good notes on shrubby species that were present. So among those listed here are redroot. Redroot is prairie redroot or inland New Jersey tea, but it's also regular New Jersey tea. In this case, this would be Cenotes americanus New Jersey tea, which is a oak savanna, oak woodland, prairie associated species. So it tells you something about the land cover. You also see hazel and wild rose in these notes. You can learn what may be missing, and the most valuable way of doing that is to visit protected remnant sites. It's part of why what the Prairie Enthusiast does is so important. If we don't have these remnant sites, it's hard to wrap our minds around what the potential is when it comes to restoration projects. If you visit a high quality, well stewarded remnant prairie or savanna or sedge meadow, those things are compelling in and of themselves. They're motivating, but they also teach you about what species occur where, what species are associated with others. And if you have opportunities to attend tours and talk to people, you learn about how those sites are managed. So you can visit sites that are nice and start to understand what some of the commonalities are between those sites when it comes to management and past stewardship, what people are doing to best express the potential of those sites. So the first one, Dry Prairie, this is a nice bur oak savanna in the South Kettle Moraine. Certainly most of it doesn't look like this. So sites like this are very valuable. A sand prairie. You should identify available resources, and there are all kinds of resources. An important one would be technical assistance. Don't be shy about asking people to visit your property. It may be difficult to get people to come out. That's part of the Prairie Enthusiast Landowner Services program. And so the Prairie Enthusiast itself may be able to provide some technical assistance. There might be specialists, experts at local universities that would have an interest in visiting your property if you have interesting geologic features or hydrological features or plant communities or rare species. But the more people you can get on your property to talk about the natural resources that are present, the more you'll know, the broader perspective you'll have. They may disagree with one another on certain things, but it'll give you an opportunity to weigh that disagreement and the basis for it. Some technical assistance costs money. It's valuable. It can be worthwhile to hire consultants if it's difficult to find technical assistance elsewhere. But there's also technical assistance that can come with funding programs. So the Landowner Incentive Program has a technical assistance component in the driftless area. The Farm Bill programs have a technical assistance component. You can get Pheasants Forever Farm Bill biologists to visit your property and at least give some initial assessments as well. It's also important to identify funding, labor, equipment, and potential for local community support before you begin a project. If you are doing a restoration project or a new prairie planting, you're going to need to do things like burn. You're going to need to do things like cut and treat brush. Those things require equipment. They require people. They require people that can implement practices using that equipment safely on the landscape. So you want to have that lined up before you get started. You want to know where seeds are going to come from. That seed availability can be difficult if you want it to be local. In some contexts, it may be more acceptable to go with commercial sources that are a little farther away. But you may also have neighbors that are doing restoration projects. They may have remnants on their property, and they may be supportive of you collecting seed for your own projects. And that can have the added benefit to them of increasing the integrity and stability of the populations they have on the larger landscape. Finally, you should develop goals and a plan. It's important to be able to assess your progress
It's important to be able to be critical and assess the progress of anyone you may hire to do restoration work for you. So at the outset, are you trying to develop treeless prairie habitat, a native dominated wetland, a sedge dominated wetland versus reed canary grass? Simply a viable population of a rare plant like kittentails, or good habitat for a rare insect like Karner blue butterfly, or a large tract of suitable grassland bird habitat that need not necessarily be all prairie. Develop those goals and what objectives you need to meet in order to work towards those goals ahead of time. And I decided to put this here because this is something we need to think about, but this is a broader discussion and a larger conversation to have. But you need to think about climate change. And the dimension of it that I've placed here is a pretty simplistic way of looking at it. It's just mean annual temperature change over time since the early 1950s. But it's important to realize that the change that's already occurred in Madison is equivalent to the difference between Madison and the Quad Cities in Iowa. The change that's already occurred in Milwaukee is equivalent to the difference between Milwaukee and Peoria. The change that's already occurred in the Twin Cities is equivalent to the difference between the Twin Cities and Dubuque. So certainly we need to be thinking about genetic diversity of the species we use in our projects. We need to be thinking about species diversity in our projects. But this is just the tip of the iceberg. And by the time we get to 2050 or 2100, these changes are going to be even greater. And so this should be an explicit part of our planning. So once you get started, and this is where I take a bit more of a specific track, I'm going to assume that we're implementing projects that try to maximize native diversity, try to restore things that are like remnant natural communities, trying to restore dry prairie to dry prairie with dry prairie species, trying to restore oak savanna to oak savanna with oak savanna species with as much diversity as possible. Those aren't the only worthwhile or legitimate restoration projects. You might be restoring grassland habitat, and that might not involve an incredible amount of diversity. It might chiefly involve area, simply so area-dependent grassland birds use the habitat. But for these purposes, I'm talking about diversity. So once you start, and perhaps this is more general here at the outset, preparation and sequence are critical. So know what you're going to need to do. And once you get started, do things in the right order and do them sequentially, and don't leave gaps that allow problems to creep in. So for example, if you're going to be doing a prairie planting on land that's farmed, don't cut off the lease a couple of years before you can do your seeding. Farm that land right up until you have the resources and everything in place to execute the seeding and the follow-up management. If farming is stopped and the field grows up with weeds like this, if it's a rich setting, a moist, fine textured soil setting, it's going to be very difficult to have success. If it's poor, depleted soils, you might have success, but it's going to take longer and it's going to require more resources, more things like mowing, more invasive species work. So certainly, you know, don't let the weeds get ahead of you with the prairie plantings. But oak savannas and oak woodlands are similar. It's a common situation where people have bush honeysuckle or buckthorn invading the understory of an oak woodland or savanna. They do the brush work. They forestry mow or cut it. But immediately following that, immediately after cutting, treat the stumps. Immediately after removing that shrub layer, take advantage of the blank slate that you have and do things like seeding. If you don't follow up, you lose your progress. This is just an example. This is buckthorn that was cut. It wasn't treated. So that's one step forward. And you can see from this picture, it's 4 steps backward. So cut it, treat it, follow with seeding. In a lot of cases, in savannas and woodlands, or prairies that are undergoing woody encroachment, there are persisting desirable plants. Those are important to coddle along. One reason why they are important is in a lot of cases in upland prairies, savannas, and woodlands, you can't rely on the seed bank. Most species do not maintain persistent seed banks. Certainly quite a few do, but the majority do not. So if they are still present, they are present as these small, struggling plants. And if you abruptly change canopy cover or do things that encourage weed growth, you can finish the job of eradicating them from a site. So if you have an oak woodland or savanna and you remove the buckthorn and you have a solid canopy, and ultimately you want a canopy cover that's less in a more open savanna, don't go from point A to point B directly in 1 year. Do the brushwork, cut the stumps, thin the canopy some, but don't do all of it. And realize that there is going to be a weedy response. So oftentimes in oak savannas and woodlands, all of the pasture weeds from when that was a cattle pasture are still going to be there in the seed bank. Those do have long-lived persistent seed banks. Brambles are going to grow. So give the species that are still there a chance to slowly recover. Invest in a good seed mix. So a lot of species aren't there in the seed bank. Whether you're doing a prairie planting in an agricultural field, or you're seeding into a savanna restoration or a prairie restoration, and invest in a good seed mix. You get the best returns on your initial seeding. Slow maturing species are needed to maintain long-term balance. Early flowering species, or sort of understory species structurally, are often missing from seed mixes. And this is a good opportunity to start to establish them. So the time to do that is with the initial planting. And sort of a corollary to that is don't overdo the fast establishing stuff, the stuff that's cheap, the stuff that you can buy in large amounts. So I'm talking about yellow coneflower and black-eyed Susan and false sunflower and bergamot. Those should be part of seed mixes for sure. But if you include too much of them, a couple of things happen. These are species that peak early. If your prairie planting is going to be something that you want to be around for decades to come, if you want it to mature into something that's diverse, well, what will happen is it'll give way to Canada goldenrod. It'll give way to grass over dominance, because these species fade and they recede. And if you use too much of them, they can also smother the slower establishing species that you want to take their place later on. They can smother things like false indigos and prairie clovers and compass plants, the longer establishing prairie species. Use bunch grasses and sedges. Many old growth prairies are co-dominated by species like prairie dropseed and porcupine grass and little blue stem. Even mesic prairies, even some wet mesic prairies, and sedges. Sedges are important too. And it's not just that this is the state of a lot of our best remnant prairies. Certainly not all of them, but a lot of them. But it has to do with just how the bigger grasses behave in a restoration setting. So they should perhaps be used, but not in more than trace amounts, because what they're capable of doing early on is co-opting space very quickly. If conditions are good for big blue stem or Indian grass or switchgrass to establish initially, by the end of their first growing season, they can have rhizomes extending out in every direction below ground several inches. So they are eating up space quickly. And if they establish densely, that's a lot of why plantings can become over-dominated by those grasses. So you get the most bang for your buck on the initial seeding, but there are also important species that establish best subsequent to an initial seeding when there's already established perennial vegetation. So this is some wood betony an early flowering species, one that's partially parasitic on a broad range of perennial vegetation that I seeded after sedges were established in a woodland setting. It would not have established well early on when there was nothing there. So things like wood betony establish well into old fields or into prairie plantings where there's already some perennial vegetation there. And just a side note on partially parasitic species like wood betony is they may play an important role in the long-term maintenance of diversity in a prairie, in a savanna, in a woodland, because they tend to suppress species that may become overdominant. If you walk through a remnant prairie with patches of wood betony or patches of bastard toadflax and other partially parasitic species, when you come into those areas, you notice that the vegetation's lower and more complex. You need to have capacity in place to burn frequently. It's fundamental, it's critical. It should be thought of as a part of the prairie, a part of the oak savanna, a part of the oak woodland, not just a management practice. Those are community types that would not have been on the landscape a couple hundred years ago if not for that force, if not for fire, except for maybe some of the most extreme edaphic situations or some of the most extremely thin soiled situations. We would not have had prairies and savannas and oak woodlands like were present. So it's critical, and it needs to be frequent, especially now. So you might look towards historical frequencies, but what's really critical is what it takes now to limit the establishment of new woody vegetation problems, limit the establishment of new invasive species problems, deal with nutrient issues, all of those sorts of things. Fire is critical for doing those things. It's also critical for maintaining biodiversity. Now, it's true that burning annually at the same time of year can push things in one direction or another. Burning annually in middle to late spring can push things towards warm season grass over dominance, but many species require frequent fires to continue to persist. And many of these species are important host plants. Many of these species are important nectar resources. What happens without frequent fire is their foliage is smothered by litter. Early flowering species are especially vulnerable to this. If the litter of the previous year isn't burned off, those things are still shaded out. And if that condition persists over years, those species can be eliminated. So burning is very important for early spring flowering species. And those are also especially important critical resources for rare and declining pollinators like rusty patch bumblebee. So burning in fall, burning in extreme early spring, really you can burn any season where fuels are present, considering other potential impacts. So you want to know what's on your site, you want to know how fire will affect all the species that are present, you want to be able to anticipate negative impacts, but you need to burn, and you need to burn a lot. Not burning enough is also the root cause of some common problems. So goldenrod overabundance in prairie plantings, warm season grass overabundance in prairie plantings, those can originate from original seed mixes, having a lot of early peaking species or not longer lived, slow establishing species. But the goldenrod and warm season grasses also do really well in an environment where a lot of litter accumulates, or at least they do relatively well compared to other things, because they're able to emerge through that litter. Their rhizomes bend upwards, their shoots emerge up through the litter, and so they are at a relative advantage. So one of the common denominators for goldenrod problems, for big blue stem overabundance, is the complete lack of or insufficient frequency of fire. It also helps alleviate underlying problems. So this is a common scenario: reed canary grass coming into a sedge meadow. Burning is not, in most cases, going to eliminate this problem. It's not going to eliminate reed canary grass all by itself. But one of the things it does is it reduces the availability of nitrogen in the system. It volatilizes nitrogen in the existing litter, and it helps push conditions back towards those that are less vulnerable to invasion. So burning is often part of an integrated approach to dealing with invasive species problems. We don't want to be continually applying chemicals at large scales in large amounts on the landscape. To the extent possible, we want to minimize the need to do that, and fire is important for that. It's important to document and monitor progress. So that includes practices that are used, the dates they're used, taking photographs so you can document the impacts of implementing those practices, keeping track of what species are present, particularly any rare species you might have. Also documenting species that are added and where they come from. So for example, this is pale purple coneflower, an endangered species in Wisconsin. It's growing in a remnant dry to dry mesic prairie. But I don't know if this is an incredibly important near northern range limit population of pale purple coneflower, or if it was seeded, because other species were obviously seeded into this dry prairie to augment it. Pale purple coneflower is there. Other species are present though that were obviously not seeded. So what's this? It's important to document those things so that, if you transfer ownership or people are doing assessments of your property to understand species distributions and abundance in ways that are significant for their conservation, it's important to document this so they know what they're looking at. Documenting work also gives you the opportunity to engage people and be involved in projects that extend beyond your property boundaries. So there are lots of tools now that people can use to document biodiversity and share it. Things like iNaturalist and Bumblebee Watch are just a couple. So the picture on the left is a northern yellow bumblebee that I documented through Bumblebee Watch on my property. And doing that is a way to learn what you have and to get expert feedback and confirmation of identifications. But it also adds to a growing data set that people can use to assess the distributions and how often people are still seeing things on the landscape. So I had mentioned some online resources that were valuable for historical aerial photography, the original land survey, and those links are at the bottom. I also recommend that people look at the Pleasant Valley Conservancy website. They have organized a lot of details around practices for restoring prairie and savanna and oak woodland. Dr. Brock also has a blog that's worth following that has a lot of good information. Stephen Packard, one of the authors of the Prairie Restoration Handbook, and one of the most well-known volunteer land stewards there is, maintains two blogs, Vestal Grove and Strategies for Stewards. They both contain a lot of wisdom and inspiration and details on specific practices. The Grassland Restoration Network blog is worth subscribing to. And like I said, those resources at the bottom, those are Wisconsin specific, but there are historical vegetation resources for other states. I've accessed historical aerial photography from Minnesota and Illinois as well. If you Google historical aerial photography and the state you're in, you'll probably find the resources that you need. So with that, I'm happy in the capacity of my position with the Prairie Enthusiasts as Landowner Services Coordinator for you to call me or email me, ask me questions anytime. I'm really interested in people's anecdotes, the things people are doing that are successful, the things people are doing that fail. I try to keep up to date on the literature, what people are doing for savanna and prairie restoration. But a lot of our knowledge really just comes from, sewing together these different anecdotes that people have, things they've done to deal with really specific problems. There aren't research programs that are dedicated to every invasive species or every community type or every sequence people might follow. So with that, thank you. And please share your questions.